Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Tuesday. It is the 20th day of October in the year 2015. It is a pleasure to be with you. Our weather continues to be superb. What would you do each day at the Virtual Center if you didn't get the weather forecast in the first minute, I'll say? It's beautiful. I'm just standing here looking out the window at the sunshine and the leaves falling on my yard that I just cleaned, mowed this weekend, and it looks like I wasn't even out there. But anyway, it's that time of year, and it is an absolutely beautiful day, and it's very comfortable outside temperature-wise. And it is a pleasure to be with you today. Today is Tuesday, of course, so we're beginning our program 30 minutes later than we usually do on our Monday and Wednesday editions of the Virtual Center. I just returned from a noon Rotary meeting, and I'm going to tell you this because we're only doing audio here. But I have a sport jacket and a necktie on today, and I had a hospital board meeting last evening, and I wore a jacket and tie, and my wife made the comment that since I've retired, I've gotten pretty slovenly. I wear jeans all the time and sweatshirts and all this other stuff. And so she said, it really is good to see you dressed up with a necktie and cleaned up and all that. She said, you still clean up pretty good. I appreciated her saying that. But I thought today, and I said, she's right. I think every once in a while it's a good thing just to do that. Is if, it kind of creates the impression, at least in your own mind, that you're doing something significant. Fact of the matter is, I am doing something significant. On this Tuesday, I'm spending an hour and a half here at the Virtual Center, which I look forward to so much. In fact, I can say my wife oftentimes says, it's a godsend that you have a program like that you take so seriously. But on the other hand, as she points out, I do put probably more time into this than I perhaps ought to. But be that as it may, I look forward to it. I enjoy it, and I love the feedback I get, and I love to hear from you, the listeners, and the participants who react to some of the things that I might throw out there for your consideration. We do have a phone number. We would love to hear from you if you are inclined to give us a call and share your thoughts and your ideas, your concerns, or whatever. With our other listeners here at the Virtual Center, we have made that possible to you by a devoted phone line. Our area code number is 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. I have an email that I would love to receive an email from you if you are a little bit reluctant maybe to get on the air but want to share your ideas directly with me. I'd love to hear from you. And, of course, if those ideas seem to be something that I believe others in our listening group would benefit from and would enjoy hearing, I will try to preserve your privacy, but at the same time, I'd like to share your thoughts and your ideas with other people if it seems to fit very well into the particular issue or discussion that we've been having. My email address is WAObrien, OBRIEN 906 @gmail.com. WAObrien, OBRIEN 906 @gmail.com. Excuse me. And again, I remind you that on Facebook that we do have a Virtual Center page. If you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you'll gain access to our page. And in fact, yesterday I put a couple of things on there, very brief things, but one of them especially, I just made reference to the fact that President Obama is scheduled to visit the state of West Virginia tomorrow. He's due to arrive in Charleston to lead a community forum type of town meeting discussion on the issue of prescription drug abuse and medication overdose. And of course, he's come to the right place because West Virginia pretty much leads the country in this negative, along with many others. And West Virginia is near the top in terms of the severity of this problem. And the thing that I put on Facebook, which is very simple, is that here in the southern part of the state, the problem is particularly acute. So to be blunt about it, here in southern West Virginia, we live in the state with one of the worst prescription drug problems in the country. And we live in the section of the state where the program, the problem is focused. It's very serious here. And in my conversations over the last couple of days, I haven't heard or talked to anybody who's been given access to the president's visit. At first, I was trying to find out if anybody from this region was even going to present or to be a participant in the president's forum. And then it dawned on me, is anybody from this region even invited to attend? And I was kind of struck by the fact that I hadn't heard from anybody. So I put a note on Facebook last evening and just asked a question. And I said, does anybody know anybody who's supposed to be attending this thing? Or is this going to be a discussion about our problem by people who have nothing to do with our region? But anyway, that's really another issue. But I did put an item on Facebook early last evening based on our program yesterday. Specifically, I quoted a couple of what I thought were the most telling lines from George Will's article in this week's Washington Post piece on Bernie Sanders and what Bernie Sanders doesn't understand about inequality. And pretty much rehashed many of the things that we talked about on yesterday's program. So if you were not able to be with us yesterday and you'd like a thumbnail sketch of some of the issues we talked about, then you can look at our Facebook page, and in a couple of paragraphs you've pretty well got a summation of what our program was about yesterday. It's really, as a comment, I might say that we have a listener who's become a listener in Massachusetts. His name is Gary, and he's a friend of my brother's. And my brother kind of alerted him to the program, and he started to listen to the program, and he's become particularly taken, apparently, with the posts that I've been putting on Facebook. I put little, what I think are little paragraphs on Facebook about what the program is going to be about, or what the previous program was about. And he made a comment to my brother, who conveyed it to me, that he particularly likes these. And he says, these little pieces are programs in themselves. And I appreciated that. But it's really interesting because you don't know until you hear from somebody like that. So if he's listening, I'd like to thank Gary and ask him to knock down a cup of that good coffee for me in the coffee shop in Milford, Massachusetts. And thank you so very, very much. Yesterday, we were looking, we had pretty much concluded and reviewed, for those of you who were with us, the Declaration of Independence and Constitution of the United States as examples of documents whose interpretation has somewhat become official. And what I mean is that there have been studies, particular studies of those two documents. In the case of the Declaration of Independence, Carl Becker's book of the same name, The Declaration of Independence, and Charles Beard's book on the economic interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, which have pretty much driven the reaction to the two documents in question to the point that they have pretty much become standard fare in our classrooms, in our textbooks, in our conversation, etc. And so the fact of the matter is, we have reached a situation, it seems to me, in our nation where people no longer read the document itself, but rather they will go to the most reputable source And to find out what the Declaration of Independence is really about, people will go to Carl Becker's book, assuming that as the expert, Carl Becker has the best insight into what Jefferson's Declaration of Independence is all about. Ditto with the Constitution of the United States, and more specifically, ditto with Charles Beard's economic interpretation and the celebration of Federalist Number 10, all of which occurred early in the 20th century. The focus that we've put on this, that I was trying to put on this, is the fact that as these particular interpretations become official, become generally accepted, and largely unchallenged, then it naturally stands to reason that alternative ways of looking at these issues tend to fade into non-existence. And over time, this interpretation of the particular item in question becomes the item itself, if that makes sense. And that educationally is not very intellectual or not very academic. But let me be even a little bit more pointed here, and this was the point that I was trying to make yesterday. If we look back in history, it becomes very clear that those in positions of power and influence, those who have the power to influence public opinion, in large part have been able to dominate and control what becomes the official interpretation of some of our most important historical events and happenings. And so, for example, Charles Beard's economic interpretation highlights the issue of self-interest as being the dominant factor in human behavior. And the acceptance of that particular position fits very well into the economic, political, and social priorities of those in positions of power and influence who seek to promote the sanctity of property, the value of individual freedom, and the benefits to the world and the world's people of free enterprise capitalism. The emphasis on self-interest, profit, success, and individual freedom, which enables it to happen, which allows it all to happen, so fits into the acceptable priority interpretation of what we want our people to accept and believe without all that much questioning, that in effect it tends to dominate. And so in the past, for example, and we looked at this in terms of Federalist Number 10, and again, I go back to Douglas Adair, the deceased historian who in the 1950s early 1950s wrote an essay on Federalist 10 Revisited, in which he laid out the impact that Charles Beard's economic interpretation had on the nation and had on the resurrection of Federalist Number 10 as the priority document in the Federalist Papers collection. From that point on, from Beard's book on, for most people, the Federalist Papers are Number 10 or spin-offs on Number 10, because that interpretation of self-interest and priorities being placed on individual freedom become the driving force of the development of industrial and economic capitalism in America throughout the 20th century and well into this one. I think the Pope's encyclical, which was issued in June, that we spent so much time on, Laudate Si, makes the point that the Pope's position is that in accepting without criticism some of the priorities of the economic system which is dominating the world, we are inadvertently buying into the process which may be destroying the planet we live on. And so the Pope's efforts in this encyclical are to re-inject considerations of moral questions into economic and political decision-making in the world. And the attacks on the Pope's encyclical have in large part been driven by this concern that if you build the moral question into this, many of the things that we have decided needed to be done would never have been done. By including or inserting the moral question back into our decision making, we would be forced to confront some of the human outcomes rather than merely the economic and political outcomes for decisions that we've been making and that we continue to make. I recently started to read a book. I'm not going to get into it now, but I just recently ordered a copy of a book. Well, I'll share it with you. It's called Divinity of Doubt. It's about agnosticism. It's a book by Vincent Bugliosi. Many of you will remember that Vincent Bugliosi is an attorney. He's the author of the very famous Helter Skelter on that maniac that was responsible for the murders in California. And he also has done quite a bit of writing on the O.J. Simpson trial. In the course of reading this book, and this is in the preface, I ran across a paragraph. And while the topic is different, Bugliosi is pretty much synthesizing or saying many of the things that we've been talking about here at the Virtual Center on the issue of reading the history or seeing the past as those in positions of influence and power want us to see it. In other words, their ability literally to control public opinion, to control what we think and what we believe, and I'll get back to this in a moment. But let me share this paragraph. Bugliosi says, what we're talking about here is the fact that most people see what they expect to see, what they want to see, what conventional wisdom tells them to see, not what is right in front of them in its pristine condition. Put another way, they only hear the music, not the lyrics of human events. He says, the only reason I mention this phenomenon is that in this book that you're about to read, I will in many instances be taking positions different from what many people are expecting to read, or would prefer to read, or what conventional wisdom tells them they should believe. And I feel that you, the reader, may be more receptive to the arguments I'm making and the inferences I'm drawing in this book if you make a conscious effort to avoid this common intellectual trap. And the common intellectual trap is to buy into worldviews or positions or points of view that have become so generally accepted, so uncritically believed, that they have reached the point of being established or official. And it becomes difficult to even raise questions about them. I found that out with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution both. That when you start to introduce the idea of the moral sense into Jefferson, into Madison, into even Hamilton, and their thinking in the Federalist Papers and in some of America's premier historical documents, you oftentimes run into people that not only haven't thought of this thing, but look at you almost as if you are creating or committing some sort of heresy, some sort of sin, that you are verging or bordering on the issue of treason when you begin to raise questions about the sincerity or about the ethical behavior and beliefs of some of the founders. In effect, what we are trying to do is understand more and understand better what the origins of the nation are about. In order to do that, education needs to be pursued in a particular way. We have got to avoid official positions. If people are really going to learn, then as much as possible, we need to try to open minds and make them receptive to alternative points of view and different ideas. In some cases, that means actually confronting attitudes and beliefs that they've never questioned before. This is the reason, and again, this isn't our topic today, but I think it warrants mentioning here. This is the reason why the issue of religion in the classroom is so explosive. In response to those many people who talk about putting Scripture or putting the Bible back into our schools, I would say that the issue there is anti-intellectual. It's oil and water. They don't mix. If the purpose of the educational experience is to learn, then minds need to be open, not closed. And that means that belief systems, whatever they might be, need to be parked at the door. When you introduce belief systems into the educational experience, that means that there are certain issues and certain items that are not susceptible to discussion or opinion or disagreement or questioning. If that's going to be true, then real learning can't happen. So what we're talking about then is a total revolution in the way we educate our young people. I believe, I have said it before, I believe it firmly. I believe that what we know as the Common Core standards are potentially a beginning to that process. I'm not going to argue that those responsible for the standards intended that this be true. But I am going to say that the purpose of the reform movement, which we call the Common Core, would make changes in the way we educate our young people, which are so profound, potentially, that they promise change in our educational outcomes that is greater than we've ever experienced before in any of the previous reform movements that we've been privy to. Many of you perhaps can relate with me, but I go back into the 80s to the very famous study that came out entitled The Nation at Risk, if you remember that one. And then, of course, we've had within the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, No Child Left Behind. And now we've had, under Arne Duncan's tenure as Secretary of Education, the Race to the Top, where we've put large amounts of scholarship money available to school systems who buy into these particular reforms. We're not forcing a particular point of view or educational way of doing business on anybody. But at times we make it financially lucrative for those who do buy in to such. But the point I'm trying to make is that while all of these reform movements had things about them that were noble and creditable, and while most of these reform movements never reached the potential or achieved the results that they were supposed to achieve. It seems to me that the Common Core poses a situation which is quite different. Because the long-term potential of this particular reform in education is literally to change what happens in our classrooms on a day-to-day basis. Because the focus is not going to be on what people believe. The focus instead is going to be on what people know and what people can do with what they know. Learning has the potential under this program to become a tool in the hands of our young people to spur and promote additional learning. We've never had that before. As I mentioned yesterday, this weekend I've spent quite a bit of time on the Common Core. And the reason I did is because last Wednesday, in our final program of last week's Virtual Center programming, I shared a document that was given to me when I was traveling through New England the previous week. More specifically, it was a document from the state of Connecticut. And it was the 4th grade learning outcomes under Common Core in the state of Connecticut. And my wife's granddaughter is in the 4th grade, so she brought these home from her teacher. And her mom gave me a copy. And what particularly caught my attention was the fact that Connecticut perennially has one of the strongest public education systems in the United States. Of course, part of the reason for that is it's one of the best funded state educational systems in the nation. The state of Connecticut, as many of us know, has the highest per capita income of any state in the union, at least it used to. And as we know, many of the most prominent, most high-income people in Wall Street and New York and everything else live in Connecticut. So that as Connecticut residents, then their income contributes to these numbers. The point of this is, traditionally, the state of Connecticut has had an educational system which is among the best. So given the opposition that we've seen here in West Virginia to the Common Core, especially from the new Republican-controlled legislature in West Virginia, and the leadership of this anti-Common Core effort in West Virginia is in the hands of a candidate for governor of the state of West Virginia, who in this past session was the president of the state senate here in West Virginia. He has committed the legislature, when the new session opens in January, to rescinding West Virginia's endorsement of the Common Core. And based on that, and based on this document from Connecticut, I set out this weekend to put something together which would hopefully defend Common Core. And what I'd like to do for the balance of our program today is to share this with you and invite your comments and your reactions to some of these things. Last week, when we touched on this particular document from Connecticut, I went through the 10 learning outcomes for the 4th grade in English Language Arts Common Core in the state of Connecticut. And one of the outcomes, one of the particular learning measures that particularly struck me was a measure related to the idea of asking children to read totally different texts on the same subject. In other words, to to potentially look at different treatments of the same topic, the same subject. But what particularly struck me, and I'll get back to that in a moment, but what particularly struck me about this is that this particular objective was, in the state of Connecticut, an objective for third graders. I couldn't believe it, because this has been one of the major challenges that I have tried to confront over the years in teaching college-level history and political science. Students have a terrible time with different interpretations of the same subject. Because what they will say, and I've had students say this off and on for years, I read this particular interpretation, it makes perfect sense to me. Then I read this other one, and it makes perfect sense to me, but it's totally different than the first one. Which one do I believe? I can't figure out which is the right one. And of course, the answer to this whole challenge, to this whole question, is that the only way you can find the answer to the controversy is to look at both interpretations critically to the point that you begin to see where the strengths are of each argument and where the weaknesses are, where the contradictions are. And as you process this and you become empowered over the different interpretations, then the best of each will emerge. And you will be able to come to a synthesis or a resolution of the contradiction. In other words, in this very small venue of these two articles on the same subject, you will be engaged in the pursuit of truth. You have this information coming from one side and this alternative information coming from the other, and you basically synthesize and mix them up and engage each of them, and you come to a synthesis of what makes the most sense on the subject, which means, in effect, that you have taken information from two sources and you have created new knowledge from that information. You have contributed to the pursuit of truth. That, I would suggest to you, is what education is all about. That's the process. And for years, I've struggled with that at the college level. Because when students buy into an interpretation that somebody else has written, I have to say to them, you have the right to agree with this, but you don't have the right to agree with it to the degree that you totally ignore what's in the competing arguments. Your responsibility is to engage all of the available data and resolve the issue. Our students can't do that. And what I found in working, for example, I've overseen or managed grants for teachers in master's level classes, and they can't do it either. So the question that I have been confronting for the last 15 years, when this has become particularly pertinent to me, is how can we expect to turn out youngsters who can do this when our teachers don't know how to do it? Well, then that goes back to the issue of the way we train our teachers. But what if those who teach in many of our colleges and universities can't do it either? What we are talking about here, potentially, is a reform of the way we deal with education whose outcome and impact has the potential of becoming revolutionary. And if we can ever pull it off, and our teachers become more comfortable with doing this, and begin to generate and turn out youngsters who are learning to do this as well. Once young people experience the pursuit of truth for themselves, real learning, there's no turning back. The revolution has happened. When that happens, these people in positions of power and influence will no longer be able to dictate the reading of the past, will no longer be able to control and tell us how to read the Constitution, how to read the Declaration of Independence, how to read or how to feel, what to believe about the institution of slavery based on the reading of something like just Uncle Tom's Cabin, for example. When people go in and begin to engage the sources for themselves, the potential is beyond belief. But again, I am not saying that those responsible for the Common Core standards know this or intended this. At this point, it is merely potential. But it is real potential. And that's why I decided this weekend that I needed to try to do something in defense of Common Core here in a state that is politically committed to their demise. So with your permission, I'd like to share with you some of this. And some of it is quite substantive. Some of it, as Bugliosi says in that paragraph I read earlier, some of it is controversial. Some of it's probably going to ruffle a few feathers and make people a little bit upset. For the right reasons, that's a good thing. So what I've entitled this piece is who's for the Common Core in West Virginia and who's against it, and why. The first issue, I think, is one all of us need to understand. Has anyone noticed that all the negative talk we hear about Common Core, especially here in West Virginia, focuses principally on where the standards came from? Who's funding the initiative? And why we in West Virginia should protect our children from it and from those pushing hardest for this particular initiative. This summer here in West Virginia, beginning early in July, on the 8th of July, the State Board of Education, getting its marching orders from last year's session of the West Virginia legislature, surveyed the citizens of West Virginia online on the Common Core standards. But this is interesting. Citizens were not asked about the standards as a package or about the concept of Common Core or about the whole idea of national standards which make comparisons between school systems, counties, states possible. The general public in these survey questions was limited to the specific standards themselves. And so this is the conundrum or the contradiction that we have created here in West Virginia. Most of the opposition to the Common Core in this state, and I would project in other states as well, is political. Most of it is coming from the top, from people with a political and economic agendas. They are attacking the Common Core based on where the idea came from. Who's funding it? Because one of the things that's come out is that large corporations, and one of the biggest ones being the Gates Foundation, have bankrolled Common Core. And the argument is being put forth over and over and over again that the Common Core is the epitome of efforts by an intrusive, overbearing federal government to take control of our school system. The implication then is that the federal government is the source of these standards. That is not true, but it hasn't stopped the naysayers. They talk about who's supporting them, who's funding them, where they come from, what the insidious agenda here of control of taking away our local control over education, our local control over our schools, all of it. In other words, people are being told that the Common Core is a devious strategy undertaken by insidious interests and powers to take over the control of the education of their own children. And many people are falling for this. Many political careers are driven by it. So when the State Board of Education here was mandated by the legislature to conduct this survey, the State Board put together a survey, but not about the standards in toto. Rather, laid out in detail the specific standards year by year in English and language arts on the one hand and mathematics on the other. The result is there are more than 900 specific standards. And the general public was given the opportunity to respond to these. The opportunity began on the 8th of July. It ended at the end of September. So in effect, citizens were given 2 months to go online, familiarize themselves with standards, and make specific comments or recommendations on particular standards. The results just became public this past weekend in the official results of the survey. More than 250,000 responses were received on the standards. These 250,000 plus standards, comments, came from 4,100 different citizens. So 4,100 citizens of West Virginia took the time to respond to this request for information or reaction to the standards. And the total of specific recommendations they made was over 250,000. 95% of the citizens who responded approved of the math standards. 97% approved of the English language arts standards. Yet, the legislature continues to argue and announce that when it comes back into session this coming January, the first order of business will be to rescind West Virginia's support of the Common Core. Let me give you even more detail. This summer, there was a meeting in the state capitol in Charleston of members of local county boards of education. We have in West Virginia 55 counties. the members of the boards of education for all of these 55 counties were given a survey of the standards this summer during their session in Charleston. The results of this particular survey is quite a bit different than the result of the survey online given to West Virginia citizens. 126 board members, which was 46% of the board members throughout the state. In other words, not quite half of the board members in the state of West Virginia responded to the survey. %52 of the 119 board members who replied to one of the survey questions said that the standards should not be rescinded. However, 48% said that they should be. So those in official positions of power and influence in the state want to rescind the standards, but the people do not. And of course, there's somebody who's going to say, and I don't have the data to back this up, but of the 4,100 citizens who responded to the survey, chances are these are your better educated West Virginians. And so basically, the results of the survey are skewed toward the upper levels of intellectual. That's probably true. But be that as it may, we have a contradiction here in West Virginia. The data tells us that the people want the standards. Oh, there were, the 95 to 5% in math, for example. Many of the 5%, many of the comments were not to abolish the standards, but to move them. Many people said this standard ought to be in grade such and such rather than grade such and such. Young kids wouldn't be able to handle this, et cetera, et cetera. So they made recommendations to move particular standards from one year to the other. But there was almost no response suggesting that the standards should be abolished or rescinded. In fact, the state superintendent of education, Michael Martirano, said that when legislators attempted to repeal the standards earlier this year, the first time, there were no criticisms even within the legislature about particular standards. So these people are being asked to rescind a program, the details of which most of the people in the legislature don't even know. So what I said in my particular piece, almost never do we hear criticism that's meaningful about the ingredients of the program. In fact, it appears that many of those protesting the loudest against the Common Core know very little about it, except that from their perspective, our kids likely won't be able to measure up. We all know, these people tell us, we have to support our kids, and we have to protect them from undue stress and almost certain failure. The fact of the matter is, most of the data on educational performance in West Virginia suggests that just maybe West Virginia lawmakers are protecting our kids all too well. And of course, I go back to the 1816 effort of the United States Senate to tax foreign books in order to keep foreign and un-American and dangerous ideas out of the hands of our young people. And former President Thomas Jefferson led the opposition to this particular piece of legislation in 1816. From the very beginning, people in positions of power have sought to control what our children believe, what they know, what they can read, what they have access to, and all the rest of it. Historically, we have done everything we can do to keep our kids from becoming educated. The masses. Not the few who go to the best schools. Now, that's something different. I believe that the Common Core has the potential to change this. And I'd like to go into a little bit of explanation as to why I think that. First of all, it's important to recognize that these people who are leading the opposition to Common Core in West Virginia say that their job requires that they guarantee our kids an education that respects West Virginia's values and unique traditions. In my piece, in my article, I have said straight up, let's be honest here, does anybody really believe this? But in answer to that question, let's look at the potential of the Common Core. I was struck by Connecticut's and the fact that a learning objective like the one I quoted earlier was in Connecticut's objectives for grade 3 youngsters. And I started to think, now, grade 3 kids couldn't handle the controversy between Carl Becker's interpretation of the Declaration of Independence and the Scottish Enlightenment approach with the idea of the moral sense and all the rest of it. I mean, that would be asking a little bit much. What would third graders do looking at an objective which talked about 2 texts on the same subject? I said, well, for example, they could read something on George Washington as a general, as a military leader. On the other hand, they could read the cherry tree story about George Washington never telling a lie and admitting to his father that he cut down that cherry tree. On the other hand, they could read something about George Washington being the father of his nation, being the first president, and what it means to be the first at doing anything. So at the third grade level, you could have 3 different pieces on 3 different approaches to George Washington. What would you ask third grade and fourth grade youngsters to do with that information? Pick one and say, is it more important that he was a general, more important that he was first president, or more important that he was honest? Hopefully, some of the kids would say that's not a fair question. Because what makes George Washington great is he was all of those things. Hopefully, some of the kids would say that. But then they would begin to get into the whys and what-ifs of Washington's role as first president, of the issue of honesty and what it means in the organization and behavior of a society, of what would have happened in America if we had not won the war for independence, if Washington had been unsuccessful rather than militarily successful. And the pursuit of these avenues, if you will, would give these kids a lot of information and a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different ideas. In other words, they would have at their disposal the research results, the data from the research on Washington's impact as an early American founder. And then they could go home with that data and put together their own perspective on Washington's significance as a hero in American history, for example. Third and fourth graders could do that. Third and fourth graders could look at the military aspect of it, look at the uniforms, look at some of the art, look at cartoons, look at all of those things. And I have to admit that as I began my research this weekend, I was a little bit dismayed to think that youngsters in Connecticut were learning this kind of thing, while here in West Virginia, our kids can't even get broadband. And then, lo and behold, I went on site to West Virginia Department of Education website. Specifically, I went on there to look at West Virginia's standards, Common Core standards, because as of yet they haven't been rescinded. They're still there. So I went to the third grade. And what do you think I found? I found the same standard at grade 3 for West Virginia kids as the kids in Connecticut are wrestling with. And I felt elated. I thought to myself, this is the first time that I ever seen evidence of anything coming down the road, so to speak, that suggests that our kids ought to have the same opportunities and the same challenges as kids elsewhere. I'm realistic enough to know that our kids probably will have more trouble with them than some of the kids in West Virginia, in Connecticut. But the fact that they are there, and the fact that they are the same, and the fact that the bar has been raised, and the fact that our kids are being asked to do the same kinds of things, I thought to myself, wow. Then I got into the ingredients, into the details of the Common Core. And what I found, that this particular standard's about 2 approaches to the same topic, was one of 10 so-called anchor standards in West Virginia. In other words, in English and language arts, this particular standard is the basis of a standard that continues to evolve each year all the way up until the end. In other words, the same standard that you see at grade 3 is there in grade 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Each year it changes a little bit. It becomes a little bit more sophisticated. It becomes a little bit more involved, a little bit more complex. It asks a little bit more of the kids. But what the standards are doing is identifying key learning behaviors that kids need to know and approaching education year by year as a developmental process. In other words, once you identify the key ingredients of a quality education in English and the language arts, then you develop and allow these target objectives to evolve year by year by year, and you constantly measure the results so that you can tell if a kid is keeping up or if a kid is lost. You can bring immediate aid to the children who are getting in trouble before they fall behind, before they give up, before they quit school. physically just leave school, or even psychologically where they just give up. So I pulled the same standard from West Virginia's Common Core standards. First, I have the Anchor, which is in grade 3. This is the Anchor standard. And then I looked at that standard at grade 3, grade 4, grade 8, and grades 11 and 12. Let me share these with you. This is verbatim, straight from the West Virginia Board of Education website on the Common Core. Here's the Anchor goal. This is Anchor goal number 9 of 10. Quote, analyze how 2 or more texts address similar themes or topics in order to build knowledge or to compare the approaches the authors take. That's the Anchor goal. That's the foundation. That's what we're after. How is that goal spelled out at grade 3? At grade 3, it says the following. Compare and contrast the most important points and key details presented in 2 texts on the same topic. Unquote. Very basic, very simple. The George Washington thing about being a general and being a leader and being an honest son would fit very well into this. Compare and contrast the most important points and the key details presented in 2 texts on the same topic. Then I looked at grade 4. I said, all right, if kids are able to do that in grade 3, what changes happen the very next year in grade 4? And I looked at grade 4. And here's that same standard at grade 4. Integrate information. Notice, integrate information from 2 texts on the same topic in order to write or speak about the subject knowledgeably. So the first one is to compare and contrast the most important points and the key details from 2 texts on the same thing. A year later, grade 4, kids are being asked to integrate information, not just extract it or not just recall it or copy it, but integrate information. In other words, take information from 2 different points of view and integrate them, synthesize them, in order that you'll be able to speak or write on the subject knowledgeably. Then I jumped to grade 8, which is middle school, the end of middle school. And I said, let's see what happens to this particular objective once kids get to the 8th grade. And this is what it says. Analyze a case in which 2 or more texts provide conflicting information on the same topic and identify where the texts disagree on matters of fact or interpretation. Now we're getting to the more sophisticated, more complex levels of critical thinking, of analysis. Analyze a case in which 2 or more textbooks, provide conflicting information on the same topic and identify where the texts disagree on matters of fact or interpretation. Now you're asking for something that's really substantive. You're saying take 2 totally different points of view, which both have conflicting information, Identify where they disagree on matters of fact and interpretation. In other words, what are the major differences? What are the major disagreements here? On what are they based? And then I looked at the end, and this is the point at which kids are applying for college as high school juniors and seniors. The 11th and 12th grade learning objectives are combined. And here's what the same topic is for 11th and 12th graders. Quote, analyze 17th, 18th, and 19th century foundational U.S. documents of historical and literary significance, including the Declaration of Independence, the preamble to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and Lincoln's second inaugural address for their themes, purposes, and rhetorical features. Juniors and seniors in high school, folks, are going to read America's 17th, 18th, and 19th century foundational documents, the documents on which this nation is built. And they are going to be able to analyze these documents in terms of their themes, their purposes, and their rhetorical features. If this were to happen, if this program went into effect and was anywhere near successful, then the struggles that I personally went through for half a century to try to teach college students how to do this would be a piece of cake at the college level, because these kids would have already done it. We would really be preparing kids for college and careers. Let me go back to the text I wrote here, because the next point I think is significant. I don't want to let the time get away from us. Unlike previous reform programs in American education, the Common Core is dramatically different, principally because it focuses on skills, not content, or what turned out to be, too often, overly hyped but ineffective new ways to present content. Unlike previous educational reform movements that I've seen, this one is different, because this one focuses on skills as much as, even more than content. The key skills in question here are critical thinking and problem solving. Both of these are essential to success in college, in today's workplace, and in life itself. This is what education has always been for the elite. This is the first time that all of our kids are being given a shot at it. I would like to believe that the opposition to the Common Core standards is driven by the fact that the people who are leading the fight against the Common Core don't know what's in them and don't understand why they should be given a try. I would like to believe that. But I guess half a century of reading and teaching history has made me a little bit of a cynic. I suspect that opposition to the Common Core, at least at the top, is driven not by ignorance of these things, but is in fact being driven by the fact that they are there. people in positions of influence and power don't want our young people, all of our young people, to be exposed to or given the opportunities to really learn. This is what I've said. Concerned principally with what kids can do based on how well they know what most profess that they already know, it appears finally that what we might have here in the Common Core is education that is truly student-centered. Education that reflects not just learning that is fixed and already complete, but education aimed instead at prescriptive, often anticipatory levels of creativity, innovation, adaptation, and flexibility toward new and often unexpected challenges and opportunities. This is the kind of education that prepares kids to deal with the unknown, to deal with the future, to deal with jobs and skills that aren't even in existence yet. This reform promises learning that is principally developmental in scope, lifelong in duration, and finally in sync with that elusive formula that does what we've been unable to do for so long. Prepare our kids for career challenges and opportunities that as yet don't even exist. By measuring the year-to-year development of these skills on tests of reading comprehension, writing, and math applications, educators can track the academic growth and progress of every student to determine how well they really understand what they're learning, can anticipate problems likely to arise for individual particular students who are having trouble before they actually do emerge, and plan early intervention strategies accordingly. Teachers can actually catch kids who are in trouble before they get in trouble. Teachers have the opportunity here to make sure that kids know what's being asked of them before they move on to the next step, which is more complex and more complicated. This is really an education that's focused on the development, intellectual development of children, of young people. It's important to know that one of the states that bought into this program early on was Kentucky, West Virginia's coal-producing cross-border neighbor. After only a few years, Kentucky is able to report some very positive results. Listen to these results from the state of Kentucky. While that state's first-year scores declined some, recent outcomes reveal that the percentage of high school graduates in Kentucky ready for college and ready for careers increased from 38% to 62% in 4 years. The performance of these kids almost doubled in 4 years under this program. If you really develop our teachers, if we really prepare our teachers to do this, I believe the potential is unlimited. Despite all of these positives, however, opposition to the program, especially in West Virginia, from very predictable sources continues to fester. For some, concern about our children allegedly remains the key factor. They know this, and they are quite correct that this program promises dramatic change in how we view our schools, what we expect from our teachers, how best to prepare our teachers, how to evaluate the best, develop the rest, and finally eliminate the worst. How finally to fund schools in ways that are both equitable and effective. How adequately to acknowledge and reward our best teachers. Many people who are leading the opposition to the Common Core know that the Common Core promises an educational future in this country which is very different in very many different ways from what education has been before in this country. For others, it's the data that the program will generate that causes the most angst. Despite what seem to be hard to challenge positives from being able annually to measure the progress of our kids against those in other states and how we stack up against national benchmarks, many worry about this kind of data in what they call the wrong hands. Of course, most who feel this way believe that any hands but their own are the wrong hands. There's also some concern that national considerations, national standards, will overwhelm community priorities and jeopardize local control over curriculum. It's very important to mention here that the Common Core talks about the learning outcomes, not curriculum. Teachers are not ordered to read or not read in their classes certain things. Teachers are given the flexibility to teach. But what they have are learning objectives. And what they have are objectives that go on year after year after year and become progressively more complicated, progressively more complex, progressively more challenging. But all along the way, we have the opportunity to catch problems before they become real problems and potentially save kids. At the same time, we're educating them. What opponents of Common Core know too well, but have never had to worry about before, is that the most substantial changes in the offing reside in popular attitudes toward education and the resultant behavior of citizens themselves. What the citizens of this country will begin to think about education and what it can do for their kids for the first time will really change. And opponents of the Common Core know this. Parents and children alike will never look at education and the promise it holds for those most adept at mastering it the same way ever again. For many, as for the few in the past, success in the classroom will assume a level of importance and demand a degree of oversight and determination in the population at large never evident before. In 1816, recently retired President Thomas Jefferson led national opposition to a Senate-sponsored tax on foreign books, intended primarily to protect the nation's young by keeping dangerous un-American ideas out of the hands of our children. Despite efforts by today's Common Core opponents to do likewise, ostensibly for the same reasons, some very disturbing international data suggests that motives much more insidious, even sinister perhaps, could be at play here. I hate to say this, But I really believe that there's data out there to make these charges and these concerns valid. What are they? Specifically, development data released by the United Nations indicates an inverse relationship worldwide between national policy decisions to invest in citizens' quality of life and ready access to wealth in natural resources. An inverse relationship between the amount of money governments are willing to put into their citizens' best interests as relates to the availability of wealth, natural resources within that particular nation. Translation: nations deficient in exportable wealth, like Taiwan, for example, must rely on human talent and creativity if they are to prosper. They have to invest in their people because they don't have the resources. The only resources they have are human resources, human capital. Whereas nations rich in natural resources enjoy the luxury to view their indigenous populations principally as labor sources for extraction. These nations, then, require less investment in the development of indigenous human capital, since most of their people are going to be working in extracting the natural wealth. There's no need to educate the kids. Their young will likely leave school early, forego high school entirely, attend college only rarely. For children of privilege, on the other hand, personal opportunity demands educational achievement, followed almost always by overseas relocation. Think of the number of children coming to the United States for higher education and graduate education from other countries throughout the world. Opportunity for them lies elsewhere. At home, it's limited to working for others. The children of those able to leave do so. Those who cannot, almost by default, underachieve academically. West Virginia, predominantly an extractive state, coal, natural gas, timber, predictably reflects markedly reduced educational levels. Traditionally, the state's brightest youngsters, those who regularly attend college and graduate, leave the state. The Promise Scholarship Program, West Virginia's tuition assistance program for its most promising high school graduates, was intended when first approved in 1999 to halt the exodus of talent and to keep the state's best and brightest at home. Unfortunately, students most likely to qualify for public assistance based on their grade points in high school annually come from families whose children would most likely go to college anyway. Despite the program's claim to be a dream come true for first-generation students, its results have not met expectations up to this point. There's an old adage, I'm getting close to the end here, so I'm moving along. There's an old adage in West Virginia that some parents don't want their kids educated for fear that they'll leave, that they'll join the parade of talent from the state. As uncomfortable as this story makes residents, there is now data available to suggest that there's some truth to this maxim. But even more disturbing than that is the related suggestion that those in positions to affect education positively are engaged instead in obstructionist activities and behavior designed to guarantee the state's most influential industries a dependable stream of labor. and that some of the most vociferous opposition to the Common Core is driven, in part at least, by these same considerations. Translation: those leading the fight in West Virginia against Common Core do so because they realize that the extractive industries in West Virginia, coal, timber, now gas, are going to demand a labor force. And while it's going to be very difficult to bring people into West Virginia, their best option is to keep the West Virginians who are already here available to provide that labor. Translation: they don't need a high-quality education. If we give it to them, they'll leave. Tell me if there's any substance to this, that it's not explosive. Like those in agricultural states whose stance on immigration reform is driven by the need for dependable, short-term, cheap farm labor, there's some evidence in West Virginia that the Common Core is caught up in like political circumstances totally unrelated to the educational matters involved. And that parents who want the very best for their children, though they have responded favorably to the standards involved in the Common Core, are in line to be shortchanged for reasons that have little to do with education. Let's hope this is not so. If it is, shame on every one of us. I'm going to do everything that I can do after our third and final program of the week in tomorrow here at the Virtual Center to edit that document so that it sees the light of day. I think it has to be said. I think time is critical here because the political steam is building for the rescinding of the Common Core. Half of the members of state boards of education in our counties have already indicated that they think the standards ought to be scrapped. The Republican-controlled legislature has made it their first political priority for the new 2016 session, which begins early in the year, I believe mid-January. It's important then that if there's to be a defense of Common Core in West Virginia, it begins soon and it be loud. I'm hoping that this piece can become part of that effort. We have 2 minutes to go in our program today. I want to thank you. I really want to ask you for reaction or response to some of these points. All of us are involved and affected by the quality of education in our schools. We all pay taxes to support our schools. We've all been looking for ways to improve the quality of our schools, the quality of our young people. I think we might have the mechanism in the Common Core to pull this off. We can't let those in power whose agenda is different than ours to cut us off at the pass, to shortchange us just when it looks like we might be on the edge of success. This is Bill O'Brien, thanking you for tuning into the Virtual Center today, tuning into the Common Core today, tuning into the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I hope that you'll be with us tomorrow. We'll review a little bit of this stuff at the beginning of our program, and then we'll try to make a return a little bit to the late 18th century in tomorrow's program. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so very much. I hope that you have a wonderful evening. Please be safe. Be careful out there. Be kind to each other, and we'll see you again tomorrow. Thank you.